Meanwhile, on the comic box. Good evening and happy Halloween, listeners. You are listening to The Comic Box, part of the Geek to Geek podcast network. I'm Rotting Rob, your friendly neighborhood comic ghoul, and we have a wonderful topic for you this week. But first, the news. We're starting on a sad note this week, as artist Steve Dillon has passed away. He is best known for his work with writer Garth Ennis. They worked together on Hellblazer, co-created Preacher, and possibly most recognizably, worked on the Marvel Knights Punisher run. Recently, Dillon had been working on the latest Punisher run with writer Becky Cloonan, which began its run this past May. Next in DC news, after 75 years as a fictional ambassador for peace, Wonder Woman has been appointed as an honorary ambassador to the United Nations. The character has been given the title of UN Honorary Ambassador for the Empowerment of Women and Girls. There was some disagreement here among the worldwide community, I suppose, because of the way Wonder Woman is often depicted and drawn in comics. But let's keep in mind that other honorary ambassadors in the UN include the Angry Birds. So, grain of salt. Moving over to Marvel, we have X-Men books. It's actually happening, folks. Marvel has announced several X titles tied into this Resurrection event, which include Jean Grey, Weapon X, Iceman, Cable, Generation X, and X-Men Gold and X-Men Blue. For those that didn't read the X books in the 90s, Generation X was a team of teenage mutants training to be X-Men, sort of like the New Mutants before them, and the X-Men at the time were actually split into two different teams, the Gold Team and the Blue Team. So, like a lot of things at the Big Two lately, this feels very much like a return to the 90s in an effort to bolster sales through nostalgia. In Marvel movie news, we have teaser trailers for Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2, which just looks fun, and a trailer for the third Wolverine movie titled Logan. I have watched this over and over. It is a great trailer. There's a lot of stuff in there you can dig into. Lots of things that we could talk about. I might dig into that a little more next week, so keep an eye out for that. I have some theories, but I want to give you all a chance to see it for yourselves first. Obviously, there's no telling how the movie will actually turn out, but the trailer is fantastic. The Walking Dead television show, usually I don't cover TV stuff in here too much, but this was a very big deal because AMC pulled out all of the advertising stops, and it was impossible to ignore the weight that they were ascribing to the premiere of The Walking Dead. The season premiere is, as of this recording, still free to watch on AMC's website as well, so I will put a link in the show notes for you. I thought it was a pretty good episode. There was some uproar over how violent it was, which is fair, but it's zombies, and there's been a lot of violence in that show, and I do still miss the F-bombs that Negan normally spouts in the comics. But now I'm probably going to wait until it's on Netflix because I don't get AMC normally. Staying in indie comics, Terry Moore, the creator of Rachel Rising, which I suggest and is a very good Halloween read, is returning to his first acclaimed creator-owned series, Strangers in Paradise, just in time for its 25th anniversary. The original run was from 1993 until 2007, and I know next to nothing about it, besides the fact that it was always on the sort of periphery of mainstream comics, very much like Bone and some of these other indie comics that went on for a really long time and were always spoken of with high esteem. And all I know is that some of the characters crossed over into Rachel Rising, and there was one other book that he wrote as well. But for you indie comics fans, if you ever were a fan of Strangers in Paradise, it is apparently coming back. Our last piece of news is a little fun piece. I am jumping back to Marvel here, but I wanted to put this at the end. Doctor Strange fans know that his fabled Sanctum Sanctorum exists on Bleecker Street in New York. And now, Google Maps knows it too. They have designated it as an official location at 177 Bleecker Street, New York, 10012. Unfortunately, going to Street View doesn't yield any cool results or anything, but if you go and you click on it and find that location, it will pop up in Google Maps as Doctor Strange's Sanctum Sanctorum. And now let's move into reviews. We start at DC with The Dark Knight 3, The Master Race, number 6. This is out of 8. It could be the extended schedule and how long it's been since the last issue came out. I'm kind of over this. Kind of over Dark Knight 3, not really doing it for me. Next is Green Lantern's number 9. We get an origin story for who I think is going to be our next villain, the Phantom Lantern. A man who almost became a Green Lantern, dedicated his life to being considered worthy, and at the last second was passed up for Simon Baz. So it's a bit of a retcon to create this villain where we go back and find out he has a history tied to our heroes, which sometimes bothers me, but I do look forward to seeing where it goes. This issue was a prelude to the next arc, so it could be a good jumping on point. If you've been hearing the things I've been saying about Green Lanterns and you're interested to see what the series feels like, issue number 10 seems like it'll probably be a good jumping on point in the start of a new arc. Hal Jordan and the Green Lantern Corps number 7, it looks to be the end of Hal Jordan. Spoilers, I guess. I mean, it won't be, of course. He's Green Lantern. And to many people, he's the Green Lantern. But it was still a good read. The rest of the Corps never actually made it to the fight. This was the end of this arc, the end of the big battle with Sinestro. And I kind of like that the whole time you had this army coming to back them up, and they never got there in time. Next issue, again, would be a good jumping on point for Hal Jordan and the Green Lantern Corps, because now we've hopefully gotten past some of the general, what's going to happen, are they going to ever meet up? The Green Lanterns are no longer in this previous universe thing, so it seems like that whole story is pretty much wrapped up at this point. Wonder Woman number 9. They're recouping from the last big battle. Diana finally does find her way home and reunites with her mother, but it's the very last panel of the book. So, again, it's a new jumping on point for the next part of the story. However, this arc itself is not finished. I'm hoping that it might be a place where you could sort of jump on midway on this arc. We have no real answers yet, but it is still interesting. I think it might be a good set of trades to pick up when they come out, but this is definitely not a straightforward superhero read. It's not bombastic by any means. Doctor Strange number 13. Interesting story about Strange fighting off Nightmare, who's an old Marvel villain who lives in the world of dreams. Sorry to say, but I might actually drop this book. It's not bad by any means, and it's an interesting premise. It's just not terrific, and I feel like at this point slimming down my reading list is a good idea, especially when I've been trying to read so many trades from the library. Mighty Thor number 12, also written by Jason Aaron. This one I'm gonna stick with. We learn the new history of Mjolnir, so we have a solid history of the hammer in this issue, which is interesting and has really gorgeous art for this one. It looks like things are moving toward this War of the Realms story, which really started way back in Thor God of Thunder, so I'm hoping that we'll move back towards those sort of really big, epic storylines, because that's where I feel Thor should live and did its best work. I keep saying that I'm hoping it's going to go back there. It looks like it's finally going to do that, and I hope that happens so I don't end up falling off of this book as well. Last in Marvel this week was Silver Surfer number 7. This is such a great comic. I'm doing my best to keep this low voice with the spooky tone, but it was such a good comic, you guys. You can read this one just on its own. You don't need to know anything that comes before. You don't need to know anything that comes after. It is another self-contained story, and that is perfect for these books. If you know anything about Marvel, I'll just say Mephisto in a fiddling challenge. It's just really good stuff. This is a fun book. Saga number 39 came out. The story continues. Nothing exceptional in this issue. It very much feels like another episode in that show that you love because it hooked you early, and now you just keep watching every episode because you just can't not. Still good, but it's definitely slowed down a lot. Next is issue 3 of the Black Monday Murders. A decent portion of this issue is actually just interview transcripts, or or not really interview transcripts, but an unauthorized recording, and so it digs a little further into history. I really like the way that they did some of this. I want to stop so I can read this book as a trade, because it feels like one that will read amazingly that way, but every issue is already like 50 pages, so I'm going to stick around. I'm going to keep reading this. I really appreciate Saga from Two British Nerds suggesting this to me, because it's a really good read. And then finally, for my backlog, I reread the 24-issue series 28 Days Later. Odd they didn't do 28 issues, I suppose, which takes place between the first and second films and focuses on Serena, as she is hired as a guide to bring a group of journalists into London, where they assume that most of the infected have starved to death. And so they want to go in and find out what's happening. It's a very good book. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I think it could be made into its own web series. It won't, but I thoroughly enjoyed that. So I suggested if you're a fan of 28 Days Later, it's a good read. And as far as Hoopla goes, I am now on volume 3 of a book called Revival. The premise is it's a small Wisconsin town, and for one day, people who had recently died came back to life and are alive again, most of them. And it just goes from there. It's not a traditional zombie story by any means. They return to their normal lives, but clearly something is wrong with them. There is something lurking out in the woods that seems to be related. I don't want to give any spoilers to you guys, but I'm enjoying it, especially as it's something that I'm able to read for free and can grab each volume. The one thing I don't like is there are apparently 7 out, at least. There are 7 that I can get from my local library, and that to me means that it's very much an ongoing, and that worries me because it feels like a story that could be amazing if it's succinct. But if it's just sort of going on and they're trying to come up with new stories as they go, it's certainly a premise that allows you to come up with many different stories and create a world around this small town. But it felt to me like it'd be a far better story if it's more succinct. So I'm still reading it for now, and I am enjoying it. I am worried, though, that it might drop in quality as it continues to go on. The poll list for next week includes Green Lantern's number 10, The Walking Dead 160, Moon Knight number 8, and Unworthy Thor 1 of 5, a mini-series where the former Thor, now just calling himself Odin's son, and Beta Ray Bill seek out the hammer of the ultimate Thor, which may be another way for Thor to become Thor again. My archive pick for you all is 2 books by the man who created Invader Zim, Jonan Vasquez. However, these are not kid-friendly books by any stretch of the imagination. These books are Squee, Squee, and Johnny the Homicidal Maniac. There's also a third book that exists in the same world called I Feel Sick. I just don't own that. I don't even know if that exists in a trade. So I don't own that one, but I do have Johnny and Squee. Johnny is exactly what it sounds like. It's a kid who kills lots of people, though there is a particular reason for it, and you find out he potentially serves a greater purpose, so I don't want to get into it. And Squee is a collection of very short stories, sort of single-issue kind of things, along with single-page comics as well. It's very dark. It is about a child that encounters all sorts of awful things, alien abductions, scary monsters. His parents can't stand him, but I enjoy it. If you have a dark sense of humor, then I would definitely suggest Squee. And then Johnny is very much its own book as well. The art is fantastic. Jonan Vasquez does a very good job. And that is our archive picks. So now let's move into our topic of the week. There's something about scary stories that we can't seem to resist, especially when we're young and ignorant of the true dangers the world presents. We read them under the covers with a flashlight long after we're supposed to be asleep. The thrill of danger, and sometimes disgust, mixed with the comfort of knowing you are, as far as you know, completely safe. This week, we're talking about horror comics. If you want to get technical about it, horror sequential art has existed since 12th century Japan. But in America, horror comics have been around almost as long as the medium itself. Pulp magazines of the early 20th century had long been the home of detective and crime stories that would often include horror motifs, and so it came as no surprise when early superhero comics also wove ghouls or vampires into their tales. Some heroes, like Dr. Occult, co-created by the same pair who invented Superman, were introduced in stories featuring vampires and other monsters. By the mid-1940s, detectives and crime comics had begun to incorporate horror motifs like spiders or eyeballs into their stories, and would occasionally feature adaptations of scary stories by authors like Edgar Allan Poe. Gilbert and Publications Classic Comics number 13, published in 1943, was a full-length adaptation of Robert Louis Stevenson's Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and is considered by some to be the first full-length comic book horror story. Then, in 1947, came Avon Publishing's Eerie, which historian Ron Goulart calls the first out-and-out horror comic book. The cover featured a bright moon rising behind a red-eyed and pointy-eared fiend. On the floor before him, bound at the hands and feet, is a beautiful young woman in a red evening dress. The golden age of horror comics had begun. Soon, large companies like Atlas Comics, a forefather of Marvel, began putting out horror comics in earnest, even renaming some of its titles to fit the genre. Captain America comics, for example, became Captain America's Weird Tales, and sometimes wouldn't feature the title character at all. The titan of the horror comics industry, however, was EC Comics, putting out series like The Haunt of Fear, The Vault of Horror, and The Crypt of Terror, later renamed Tales from the Crypt. You may have heard of it. Each of these series featured an omniscient narrator, the Old Witch, the Vault Keeper, and the Crypt Keeper, respectively, introducing each issue's stories. This practice was born of early radio serials and would continue into the age of television with series like The Twilight Zone. EC's success resulted in a massive wave of imitators. Weird adventures, weird horrors, weird chills, weird mysteries, you get the idea. However, the success of the horror genre was not to last. In 1954, Dr. Frederick Wertham published Seduction of the Innocent, which claimed, amongst other things, that horror comics were a direct cause of juvenile delinquency. He claimed that they stimulated deviant sexual behavior with their depiction of women being tied up, and that Batman and Robin represented and I believe I'm quoting here, a homosexual wish dream. He said that a conspiracy was at work with a small group of evil masterminds, preying upon the defenseless minds of the young and strong-arming artists and vendors to work for them against their will. He had reached this conclusion by interviewing those in juvenile detention and learning that many of them, in fact, read comic books. Of course, most kids of the day read comic books, but this thought seemed to have never occurred to Dr. Wertham. Following the publishing of the book, public criticism resulted in a Senate subcommittee on juvenile delinquency. Naturally, Dr. Wertham insisted on appearing before the committee, entering into evidence the cover of Crime Suspense Stories, that's one word, Suspense Stories, issue 22, which featured a man's hands holding an axe covered in black blood and what appeared to be the severed head of a blonde woman. The committee's final report didn't blame comics for crime, but recommended that the industry voluntarily tone down its content. The message was clear: police yourself, or the federal government would step in. By this time, nearly a quarter of all comics were horror-titled, but in 1954, the Comics Magazine Association of America created the Comics Code Authority. If you've ever seen an old comic, you might recognize the little symbol that would appear saying authorized by the Comics Code Authority. Now, those who didn't follow the code's guidelines were unlikely to find distribution, and those guidelines forbade, and this is another direct quote, all scenes of horror. The heavy censorship led to the complete revamping or outright cancellation of many long-running horror series. Horror titles became mystery, suspense, or science fiction books. The gore-filled age of horror comics had effectively ended. The genre refused to die, however, with some publishers turning to black and white horror comics magazines, which did not fall under the code. The code itself relaxed in the 1970s, allowing for the resurgence of mainstream horror-themed comics like Tomb of Dracula, Werewolf by Night, and, of course, Swamp Thing. Since then, the genre has risen and fallen in popularity, but it still holds a firm niche in today's diverse world of indie comics, with titles like The Walking Dead and Hellboy commanding massive followings. But, despite high sales, we will never return to the age when a quarter of all comics published were horror titles. And that is our topic of the week. I hope you all enjoyed this very special, very toned-down episode just for Halloween of the Comic Box. If you like this episode or our show in general, this show in general, please consider leaving a star rating or a review. This is the best way to help out the show, grow the audience, and keep me going. Of course, this is part of the Geek to Geek podcast network, so don't forget to head over to geektogeekcast.net, where you can sign up for details on all of the other great podcasts that are included in our network. You can also join the conversation on Reddit. We have a subreddit, which is /r/geektogeekcast, where we talk about every one of our episodes, as well as all sorts of other geek culture topics. You can find me on Twitter at Rob's Comic Box, or if you'd like to know more about me that doesn't involve comics, I have a personal Twitter at Noby, that is at KNOWBY. You could also send me an email at thecomicboxpodcast@gmail.com. All music from this episode was written and performed by me for the 2006 award-winning UTVS television special, Silent Souls Riverview. It was used here without permission, because the dead don't need to follow the laws of man. Stay tuned next for something very special. I have said before how I helped put together the audio for a ride down at a haunted attraction in Iowa, and I'm going to tag that on to the end of this episode. You're definitely going to want to listen to it with headphones, and unfortunately, you're just going to have to imagine all of the bumps and shakes that go along with the ride. This has been Rotting Rob, your frightening neighborhood comic ghoul, closing the comic box for this week. Happy Halloween. And remember, this Halloween weekend, don't look under the bed.